Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, wherever, good evening, good night, wherever you are. Welcome back to Robots and Red Tape. As always, I am your host, Nick Schutt. And first, just want to thank everybody out there for listening and participating and being a part of what is the best part of the show. So, really, really appreciate that. Really happy to have my friend Abby Kearns here with me today. Abby, how are you?
I am great. And thank you so much for having me on this fine summer day.
Absolutely, 100%. Really, really, really glad that you're here. And for everybody that hasn't had the opportunity to meet you or talk to you yet, I know you said you spoke to 80 people or so this morning. So, it's a lot of people, but I'm sure there's a lot out there you haven't talked to. Do you mind just telling everybody a little bit about yourself, your background, and kind of how you got here and what your story is?
Yeah, I think everyone says this about their own backstory, or their origin story, however you want to frame it. It's not as
Mhm.
interesting. But I've been in tech, more than 25 years. All of it's largely been in the enterprise space. And while most people don't necessarily get excited about enterprise infrastructure, it was my first job out of college and I fell into it and have never left. I
Mhm.
love the fact that when you think about enterprise infrastructure, particularly infrastructure, it's the fundamentals of everything that everyone else builds. So, all the consumer apps that we all use, all the different ways we all interact with technology, infrastructure underpins everything. And it's just really shaped the entirety of my career. And so, for me, I'm very passionate about the technology that allows everyone else to do interesting things with technology. Today, I am the CEO of ActiveState,
Mhm.
and I've just been here 3 months. But
Amazing.
before that, I had a couple of CTO stints. One at an AI startup, and before that at Puppet. And before that, I was CEO of Cloud Foundry Foundation, which was an open source software foundation. So I've actually done a lot around infrastructure and done a lot around specifically open source. And that's going to be a big theme of our topic today.
Absolutely. And having spent more than 25 years in enterprise and specifically enterprise infrastructure, and this with a huge focus on cloud infrastructure and open source, and now we're talking everybody's talking about AI and what that means. What are some of the biggest shifts you've witnessed across all of those different eras?
I mean, you basically, if I look at my career, when I started in tech, in the late '90s, early 2000s, when I first came into tech, the big thing that was going on was the investment in e-commerce. So e-commerce was just starting. So the idea that you can go to a website and put your credit card in and get something was new and it was novel. And it was super fun to be a part of building that out and building the infrastructure out and allowing some of the earliest websites to be built and launched.
Hmm.
And then, flash forward, 15 years later, we really started talking about cloud native. And essentially, the definition of cloud native was the ability to run smaller applications effectively in the cloud.
Hmm.
And, around 2013 is when Docker really got released, and we started really thinking about containerized workloads. And then the term cloud native was coined a couple of years later. And so that represented a massive shift in the way that we build and run applications at scale. And the cloud really started taking off. And then, flash forward to 2022, and all of a sudden now we're talking about AI and specifically generative AI.
Hmm.
And that really changed the way we think about what AI and specifically what automation can do for us. And then now, like, it's been a game changer in 2026. Like, the last couple of years with AI have been interesting, but there was a step change December, January, so kind of January of 26, where all of a sudden it became very interesting. A lot of new frontier models were released that really fundamentally changed the game, up to the quality level, up the confidence, and the outcomes. And then we saw, it wasn't just what was it, February, that OpenClaw was released, and we started really meaningfully talking about agentic workflows and agentic
Hmm.
automation. And so it's been interesting for me, across these different eras to see that the technology cycles have just spun up.
Hmm.
When I started in tech, 25-ish years ago, technology cycles were 5, 6, 7 years. shift to cloud native time where we started developing smaller applications, the technology cycles were like a year and a half to 2 years.
Hmm.
And now we're like seeing full life cycles quarterly with AI and particularly frontier models, with the big news this week of obviously Fable 5 being released from Claude, which is under the Mythos structure. And
Hmm.
I think it's really, really fascinating how fast the cycles are moving on the evolution of technology.
I agree, and I think that I think you've done a really good job enunciating how that is accelerated, and I think it's going to continue to accelerate. Especially as you look at AI and the kind of AI arms race that's happening, not just between these large models within the states, but then you start looking at the geopolitical aspects of these AI battles between us and or the U.S. and other countries, China specifically. But with all of that, Abby, and obviously with your experience and the focus on open source, how do most organizations out there understand how dependent they are on open source infrastructure?
Shockingly, no.
Mhm.
If you ask people how much open source they have in their organization, everyone says some, sure, and they think about the top, open source packages they may be using or may be top of mind. But, when you dig into it, most people don't understand exactly how much open source is in everything that they build, run, and ship. To put a statistic on it, about 98% of every piece of software that's out there is open source. And when you think about that, that's not just some of the more common open source packages, everything from the infrastructure tooling
Hmm.
that runs things like Kubernetes. There are obviously the container orchestrations and the containers themselves, which are open source, like Docker. But just think about all the other little things that are inside of everything that we build. Open source is part of it's a building block of literally everything from the language you use to write the code in to the building blocks of how that language functions within your application. And so, yes, we've been using and consuming more open source over the last 10 plus years. Every organization is now fairly comfortable with it, but
Hmm.
I don't think people recognize how truly pervasive it is and what are the ramifications of that, the pervasiveness of that open source in organizations.
What are they?
Well, if you have been paying attention to the news, particularly the last couple of months, package managers themselves, like think of NPM and others, are becoming attack vectors. Those open source packages that you're pulling in, the dependencies of those open source packages that you're pulling in that most people aren't even tracking, are now an attack vector, and they're an
Hmm.
entry point for malware. And it's no longer CVEs that are being exploited or 0 days. It's really those packages that are as an entry point for new malware that organizations are developing that is getting more clever and it's harder to detect. Your scanners don't detect it. It's becoming much more complicated to unfold. And so AI has given us all a great opportunity to develop new and interesting software, but it's also given the people with malicious intent also the same skill set.
Absolutely, and I mean that's also what's so interesting about Mythos and how and its ability to detect vulnerabilities within huge corporate stacks, right, or any stack, which is I think why people are paying them to not release it to the public. But and while that may be the best one out there, that's certainly not the only one out there. And if
No.
the number two or number three can probably detect 75% of what Mythos could detect, and yeah, there's a lot of you know danger as things continue to accelerate within the AI space. Because, and I mean, it's all higher level. To your point, I think it's all higher. That's all higher level technical work, but it all runs on the same stuff, right? The same enterprise infrastructure that has all of these open source things baked into it.
Well, I think it's everything. It's not just the infra, but it's basically all of the tooling that everyone is using is also comprised of largely of open source. If you're writing your ML workloads in Python, Python is an open source project.
Hmm.
And by the way, if you're using AI code generators to help you generate your code, a lot of it is Python and TypeScript. And so that is all open source, and it's pulling packages from other upstream dependencies. And so I just think that it is one of those areas that I feel like should be a bigger focus, if not the very least, a topic of conversation, given the risk with it.
Absolutely. And so, I know you just joined ActiveState recently, as you said. Why did you join them specifically, and why now?
Well, I joined because ActiveState is long been a steward of building, running, and managing open source language libraries. It's been around since 1997 and has been an active contributor, steward of open source for many decades, and recently had pivoted to really taking that
Hmm.
knowledge and applying it to say, how do we take the knowledge around the building, running, and managing these language libraries? And how do we say, let's apply some security to that, which is say, not just giving you the language, but how about we pull that down, rebuild it for you in a secure environment, and then make it accessible in a catalog for you so that you're consuming the components or the build,
Hmm.
but it's guaranteed to be secure. And that really appealed to me because as I looked at the landscape of what's going in open source, so you just talked a little bit about Mythos, but this is true of any frontier model. Its ability to identify CVEs, identify opportunities or risk in software, and that's a growing risk, coupled with the fact that AI code generators are helpfully identifying risk and helpfully submitting pull requests to those upstream open source communities.
Hmm.
And those communities are managed by people. And they're often managed by people that this is not their full time job. So those contributors, maintainers are doing it for the love of the technology and the community. They're often not paid and they're often not working on it full time. And so if you marry that limited human capacity with a ton of flood of pull requests with helpful updates to identified CVEs, well then you can imagine the amount of effort and the amount of backlog that's starting to build up. And
Hmm.
so as I looked at this growing concern, which is there's going to be a massive gap between known CVEs, so those critical vulnerabilities identified in these upstream open source packages, and the ability to mitigate those in the upstream, well, that's just spelling a bigger risk. And so companies like ActiveState, so a company that has a long history with open source packages and open source language libraries, and the ability to deliver a secure solution to customers really appealed to me because I just felt like this is going to become a growing concern for everyone.
I completely agree with you, and it's a fascinating time to be in that space, especially considering the dependencies that you've already established that folks have on open source, whether they know it or not. And something that I really thought was very interesting in our initial conversation is you brought up, a concept called transitive dependencies. And can you explain that and explain a little bit more about what they are and how they create so many vulnerabilities?
I will probably do a very poor job of explaining it, but I would say that, think about it this way. You're writing your code in Python
Hmm.
and you're writing an ML application. And so if you're writing in Python, there's a lot of specific aspects of Python that you need, different packages, different libraries to do the task you're doing. And you may need something like pandas, or you may need uh, NumPy or scikit, which are very specific to specific ML capabilities that you want to bring in. And those libraries have also packages they pull in from others. And so all of a sudden, it's almost like a Russian nesting doll of little packages. Well, I need this from this upstream open source project, and I need this library from this package. And all of a sudden, it becomes a pretty crazy tree of dependencies that are required for you to build this application.
Hmm.
And so when we talk about transitive dependencies, it's all of those other packages, those other libraries that you're pulling in from a variety of sources. Like this isn't all coming from one source, by the way.
Hmm. Yeah.
That's where it just really gets complicated because maybe you feel confident in this one one package or this library you're pulling from this specific location, but maybe you didn't realize there was three others being pulled in. And so it's just more of it goes back to the awareness piece, but then it's also like, you know, do you know that's secure? Do you know who built it? Do you know where it came from? How is it maintained? How often is it updated? Like, and that's just where a lot of questions that I think are very hard to answer today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the old supply chain, right? And it doesn't matter what you're building,
Exactly.
software, or you're building a widget, or you're building a phone, or you're building a missile, or you're building a ship. Like at some point, somebody needs to pull raw materials out of the ground and process them, right? And then get them to you, and then you need to get them and acquire them, and maybe you're not buying things until they're 3 or 4 or 5 steps removed from the initial manufacturing process. And so yeah, that interdependent supply chain really creates a lot of vulnerabilities, especially when you don't know where the initial things come from, right? Um,
100%. And that's really where, both the level of complexity comes in, but also the level of risk starts increasing
mhm.
because you don't have eyes on what those transitive dependencies are. You most often don't even know, you're not even aware. Um, and so I think that's really one of the areas that I was excited about ActiveState's focus on, which is to say, we're going to make these packages available to you. And we're going to pull everything in for you. And we're going to take care of that. And we're going to make sure it's secure. And we're going to make sure that this one random package you're pulling in is potentially not malicious.
Absolutely. No, 100%. And how is the proliferation of generative AI really changed this? Has it just made it easier for people to find those vulnerabilities downstream and exploit them, whether or not they are whether or not they're aware of them, from a like whether or not the consumer's aware of them, I should say. Because like somebody like me, I'll just download an app off the App Store and I don't really know what goes into making it run technically.
Well, I think there's some of that. So I'd say actually a couple of different aspects to it. One is AI code generators are great. I use one all the time, every day. I think it allows us to develop and create ideas that we might have and really puts a ton of power in our hands. But it does that because it largely takes care of pulling things in for you. Like, oh, you want to build this web app? Great.
Hmm.
I'll let me build it for you. And in order for me to build it, I'm going to pull all of these packages and libraries and code from all of these different places while creating additionally additive code. And I'm going to present you with the answer.
Hmm.
And which is great. We love the answer. But sometimes there is the devil is in the details around where do those things come from. And so I think AI code generators have accelerated the use of both a lot of different packages that maybe prior a human would have at least either been aware of or understood they were grabbing this package from this location. But then the flip side of that is AI code generators are, these frontier models are not only identifying CVEs that exist in these different open source projects, but they're also creating them. And so you have both aspects happening, both the identification and you have the exposure through
Hmm.
known critical vulnerabilities. But then the flip side is you're also able to create those malicious opportunities within existing packages, and sneaking stuff in that is probably not known or probably didn't exist prior. So I think it's both things are true. I think AI definitely allows us to do a lot more, which is fantastic, but it also allows everyone to do a lot more, both those with good intentions and those with less than stellar intentions.
Absolutely. And as you think about this within enterprise environments, right? You think about how there's this race within organizations to find ways to implement AI and make it useful. And nobody wants to be left behind, as with that, Abby. But also, in addition to nobody wanted to be left behind, I think people are really pushing for a lot of AI implementations, but without considering the cybersecurity implications of it. What do you think? Do you think organizations are moving too quickly without really understanding or adapting their security practices within the new environment?
I mean, obviously, but I mean, that's been true of every single one of the previous phases I've talked about. Like the early days of cloud native, the same things happen, which is how fast can we move to the cloud? And then a year later, oh, we should probably think about day two, and we should probably think about security and
Right.
compliance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're seeing the same thing happen now, which is organizations are rushing to adopt AI and do tons of experimentation, which they should. There should be a lot of experimentation. I think there's a ton of opportunity, and real innovation that AI can unlock in organizations. And I think they're optimizing for rollout, getting people comfortable, a lot of trial and error and
Mm-hmm.
experimentation. And then the fast follow will be security, compliance, governance, those key facets that really ensure that, hey, all of these things we're doing, we should
Right.
probably be thoughtful about what data it has access to,
Mm-hmm.
what data it can exfiltrate. AI wants to be super helpful. It wants to go get all the data for you. Like, you
Yeah.
just want to make sure that it's not exposing, critical proprietary data, but also making sure that it doesn't delete anything that maybe might be important. So,
Mm-hmm.
like I said, AI wants to be super helpful. It's like a really, really, really helpful intern that just wants to just do good things for you, and you just need to put a little guardrail around it.
Yeah, the best description I've heard of AI from anybody on the podcast is that he said that these they're like it's it's very very great predictive algorithms, but they're not very intelligent. It's like if you had somebody that has read every single book in a library but has never had a real conversation.
It's a lot like that.
Hmm.
It's, I think that the helpfulness in the integration of AI fools us into thinking that it can do a little more than it can. But at the end of the day, it's a machine learning algorithm.
Hmm.
It will only do what it knows what you want it to do, which means prompts are important, constraints are important, guardrails are important.
Hmm.
I think that I think the emphasis really has to be on what data are you putting in, what am I providing access to, and what are the guardrails around that access. And
Hmm.
like I think we've all done enough experimentation now with generative AI that we know, the old adage remains true: garbage in, garbage out with a computer. And if you just like throw something in, we've all read when someone's just put a kind of a, we'll just say, a half-ass prompt in and just generated something, and Cloud will
Hmm.
like give you 1,000 words on something, and you're like, it'll just make up stuff because it doesn't know what you want. And so, we've all read those documents and compared with someone that actually put in the
Right.
guardrails and the context and was very, very focused on what am I trying to create here. And, side by side, even though they're both generated with AI, they are worlds apart. And I think it's the same, which is AI only will actually apply the rigor that you put on it. And it is actually more incumbent on you to put more thought into whatever you're trying to do rather than less thought.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And with your background in open source, do you think any of these open source models will ever challenge some of these proprietary models for performance?
They already are.
Okay.
Kimmy and Quinn are on pace with Opus 4.6, Opus 4.7. Like, they're already are, like, 100%.
Okay. Do you think they'll challenge them for market dominance or no because of the
Yeah,
yeah?
they totally will. They're free.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do I want to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for a tool, or do I want the commiserate version for free?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's the conversation. And like, look, yes, they are built in China, but they're open source. So are the weights. So you could just pull it down, run it in your own environment.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is the truism of open source since it's been a thing, which
Mm-hmm.
is to say, if a open source project is commiserate to a proprietary
Mm-hmm.
product,
Yeah.
even if it's not as feature rich as the proprietary product, users will go after the open source first because it's free.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. I mean, you just need to have your own compute, which if you're working in an enterprise environment shouldn't be too much of an issue, right?
Absolutely not. Like, most people have GPUs and access to GPUs now, and if not, even if you're not running it in your own colo facility or your own data center, the neo clouds, you have access to so many different neo clouds now that you could have access to all the GPU that you need.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned agentic workflows and, some autonomous systems a little earlier. What do you think most people misunderstand about, this technology and where it's heading and how it actually works and how it could be used, within organizations?
Well, I think there's a couple of layers to this, which is automation, particularly the automation we all aspire to, is something that's very hard for people to get comfortable with. Let's just think about people that have Teslas, and you get in a Tesla and you
Hmm.
put it in self-drive mode, and there's a level of confidence you have to have in that software and
Yep.
that it's not going to end poorly because I'm like putting my life in the hands of this software.
Hmm.
And I think that's been true for decades, by the way, on any other automation software. Like, think about infrastructure as code, which automates the entirety of your infrastructure management.
Hmm.
And it can make a lot of changes for you. It can do a lot of things. And if left to its own devices, if structured well, it's amazing. But if you configure it poorly, it can do a lot of damage really, really quickly in your
Hmm.
environment.
Yep.
And so it makes a lot of people, rightfully so, nervous. And I had a customer years ago that likened it to running with scissors, and I'm like, it's not a bad analogy. Like, you can do that safely, but also you could do it in a way that could create a lot of harm. And so
Hmm.
I think, you apply that same logic to agentic systems, and it's the same, but we're adding a non-deterministic aspect to it, which is like, hey, we're going to automate things. So event-driven orchestration, event-driven automation is a very complicated thing to do. It's
Hmm.
very hard because you're actually allowing different facets of that workflow to have autonomy on the choices it makes, which is it
Terrifying.
can be great, but also it can again create a lot of harm if not if not structured correctly or the right policies not applied. And then you add the non-deterministic layer to it. Now all of a sudden, where we've spent the last 3 decades with in computers, which is I tell the computer to do this, 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 and it does this, this, this. Now you're applying a non-deterministic aspect with LLMs, and maybe it does this, maybe it does step one, step two, and then it's like, for step three, I think I'm just going to change my mind and I'm going to do something different, and it can do that. And can you set up the appropriate guardrails for that? Sure, but it's just an entirely different way of thinking about
Hmm.
the entirety of that automation pipeline. And I think at scale, it's trickier than
Of
people fully appreciate. And
course.
yes, there are some companies that are doing it and doing it well, but for every one of those, there's a dozen that it's going to take a while to really sort through how to run that at scale.
No, absolutely. I mean, everything's harder at scale, right? As you look at it, right? Scale complicates everything.
Absolutely.
Easy to do for one person just gets exponentially more difficult the more people you add or processes you add, right? That's why you start looking at these organizations that are supporting millions or billions of users. Like that's a different conversation than the little tool that's being used by 15 people. But all of those tools have open source built into them.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned earlier, like there's a lot of small teams and volunteers that are doing this, that are maintaining all of this tooling, and it's also super critical to all of these large softwares that things that public infrastructure run on. To maintaining them and making them work. So first, do you think that this model is sustainable? And how should we really be treating these open source projects like public, like critical infrastructure?
I don't think it's sustainable. And then I do think we should treat a lot of open source projects as critical infrastructure. We absolutely, and I think there's been a push for this. This is not a new conversation. There's been a push for this for years. Linux Foundation has shepherded a lot of these conversations. In fact, creating a foundation around critical infrastructure, those open source projects that are fundamental to the way the internet works, for example,
Hmm.
that have one maintainer, and that maintainer may or may not have retired years ago. And so Linux Foundation has done a great job of shepherding that conversation, and the same thing through the the open security Foundation, the Open SSF, also on the security side of that, saying, hey, we really need to commit to contribution from a lot of these big companies to
Hmm.
figure out a way to support and maintain this critical infrastructure. And I think that, some other companies, IBM recently announced its focus on helping address some of the growing gap in open source as well.
Hmm.
But I think a lot of people are recognizing it as a problem and are trying to figure out ways to contribute to that, but
Hmm.
absolutely it should be treated as critical.
Yeah, I completely agree. You look at the to your point, the internet runs on this stuff, and there's a lot of mistakes. And there's a lot there's not a lot of margin for error when you look at, and I mean, I don't remember, like, you mean you remember there was the CrowdStrike crash a couple years ago where like
Yeah.
all the flights just couldn't take off because of things, because of, again, software supply chain breaks down, right? And then all of a sudden you just can't fly. And I know I don't think that, I'm not attributing that to open source at all, but it's just like that's a very public facing example that I can think of where something further up the supply chain breaks, and then all of a sudden there's these massive downstream stream implications that people just didn't realize were going to be a thing.
Well, I think everyone should realize that that is absolutely a situation. Like
Hmm.
we're all, I mean, that's been true for the last 2 decades. Everything runs on software. The second there's an issue with software, like, the Delta incident with CrowdStrike is not the first. Every airline, every major global airline has had this issue where some of their systems have broken down and it's canceled flights. And this has been true. I would say I started my career working on technology for a major airline. And there was a couple of cases back in the early 2000s,
Hmm.
even where planes were grounded for
Hmm.
many hours because of a backend system
Hmm.
was broken. And so I think the more reliant we are on technology, the more that is, a potential. Like, for example, when AWS's EC2 West or EC2 East is the one that's most common, goes down, and all of a sudden Netflix doesn't work.
Hmm.
Or, you know, what is it? There's been some others where the CDNs go down and all of a sudden you can't log into anything. Or, it's just like there's a lot of little things that when they go down,
Hmm.
everyone recognizes, oh, wow, this
Yeah.
actually impacts literally everything else. And so
I
we're
can
in the
think
age of software.
I remember a couple of times where something happened and then like multiple cell networks go down, right? And
Yeah.
all of a sudden, like, AT&T and T-Mobile just don't work.
That happens. Like it's all software, particularly some of these older systems.
Hmm.
Keep in mind these systems are 30 years old that are still running a lot of the critical
Yeah.
things that we access. It is 20, 30-year-old technology. And so it is frail, it is complicated. And the
Yeah.
older it gets, the harder it is to maintain sustainability and reliability with that
Absolutely.
technology.
I remember there was one point where the banks paid Microsoft to continue supporting Microsoft XP because every single ATM was running on XP.
I would say that it's way worse than that. But
Well, yeah,
yes.
way, way worse.
There's a
Absolutely.
whole bunch more where that is. There's like, software that's been end of life for 20 years that companies are still running because and that's largely because it's very complicated to
Mhm.
figure out how to move off. It is not, particularly for these long-lived, critically critical infrastructure solutions. It's very difficult to find a way off and to update it. It's not a simple endeavor. And so many companies and organizations are like, well, let's just try to keep this thing running, and as opposed to trying to update and then
Mhm.
eventually potentially rebuilding something new and migrating. But it's very, very hard to do.
100%. And how do you think, how do you, when you're advising companies about evaluating open source projects, how do you determine whether it's trustworthy or not before you start integrating it into critical systems?
I would definitely recommend people take a look at the upstream open source package. So most of them are in GitHub. I would encourage people to go to GitHub and look at GitHub Insights
Hmm.
and look at uh, how long has it been around? Has it been around for 20 years or 5 minutes? How long, how many maintainers and contributors does it have? How actively
Hmm.
is it being contributed to? Is there a lot of work happening on it currently, or has no one touched it in 10 years?
Hmm.
Um, it gives you a good sense of how actively it's being maintained. And if, hey, maybe that you don't care if it's being maintained, you just want that tech and you're going to fork it and own that distribution yourself, then
Hmm.
great. But then also acknowledging that I am owning this. This is now my distribution of this project, and
Hmm.
I'm responsible for everything, fixing it, identifying any critical vulnerabilities, fixing those critical vulnerabilities, et cetera. Like, it's just understanding what you're taking on and just doing it intentionally versus being surprised later.
Absolutely. No, 100%. And as you look forward, how do you think the relationship between open source software and AI will continue to evolve?
Aggressively. I think we're just like in this really, really fast innovation loop with particularly frontier models.
Hmm.
And, what are the byproducts of that frontier model innovation is just unlocking everything else. And so I think the innovation cycles are going to just continue to speed up. I think eventually will taper off, just like any new technological innovation does. But I think that in the meantime, I think through the rest of this year, we're just going to continue to see that really fast innovation cycles
Hmm.
and really fast growth, until we really figure out what does this actually mean?
Hmm.
Because I think we all have some ideas of what the world and our workplace is going to look like in a couple of years, but I think we don't know for sure. If
Yeah.
we look back at prior major step changes in technology, the easiest example is the iPhone. The iPhone came out in 2007, and
Hmm.
it was interesting. It was a phone. It took pictures. It was pretty cool. You could text. But then, a year later, when the App Store came out, and all of a sudden applications started getting developed, now your iPhone that took photos and text on now is like your everything. Like
Hmm.
today, I think all of us would say, for those of us that use iPhones, it is everything. It is my wallet, it's my boarding pass, it's how I get food, it's how I get transportation. I can pay bills. Like, I do everything on my phone.
Me too.
But I think if you'd ask us all in 2007, would you give up your computer and your wallet in exchange for this phone? I think we'd have been like, probably not.
Right. I'm with you.
But now most of us just run around with our phone and no wallet.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the state I live in has an app where you can have your ID on your phone, right?
Mine does too.
Everything is going there, right? And then I think it'll be interesting to see how it evolves with wearables and things like that. But also, to your point about your point about AI and how it's going to continue to accelerate, I think that it's going to happen a lot faster than it did with the phone, because of the phone
Totally.
to empower a lot of that change. But I think it's gonna be even more life changing than the phone was to me.
And just think about when all the dots start getting connected, even on your phone. Like, let's just think about our phone. Your phone has, how much information does it have about you?
Too
It's
much.
got where, but I mean, it's also, well, there's too much. But if you think about, like, hey, what are the basics that it doesn't do today? Which is, it knows when my next meeting is.
Mhm.
It knows where I'm at. It knows how long it takes me to get there. Like, what's the step to say, hey, your next meeting is downtown. It's going to take you 35 minutes to get there, by car, or 40 minutes by train. Let me optimize that for you. You need to leave. And like, all of a sudden it's creating reminders, leave now. Here's how you need to go.
Mhm.
Or, hey, you're running late. I'll automatically notify
Yep.
who you're meeting with, that you're running late. Like, these are just little things, but just imagine when things like that start to get unlocked, and,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden we start, really activating all of those data points that we have. Like, obviously there's way too much data that we don't want activated, but I think there
Yep.
are some low hanging, things that I think would be really interesting and would make measurable impact to people's lives, that, once a lot of the dots start getting connected with the technology.
I completely agree. It's going to be really interesting to see how it works, and how it develops. As we get ready to wrap up, Abby, is there anything else that I forgot to ask you? Anything additional points you'd like to make? Anything at all?
I think that having more people talk about open source and
Mhm.
where things are going with AI, I think is great. I think getting more awareness and getting people engaged in the discussion, I
Mhm.
think it can be a little scary. And I don't want to necessarily harp on, hey, look at all of these daily breaches that are happening. But I do think, the more informed people are, the better decisions they can make. And there are solutions out there for people if they want to learn more. And I would encourage people to educate themselves.
I couldn't agree more, and I really appreciate you coming on and offering your opinion. It's fascinating to think about how interconnected and interdependent all of this is on, some guy in Iowa updating his server that has been running this one project for 35 years in his basement, right? Like fascinating.
I think more people would be shocked if they realized exactly how critical this one little project, this one little library is that one person is running.
hmm Absolutely. But I appreciate it. I appreciate you, Abby. Thank you so much for coming on. I've really had a great time talking to you.
Likewise, thank you for having me. It was so much fun.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And everybody, thank you for listening to Robots and Red Tape. I hope you're having a great day.